Good morning, everybody. This is Brad Rustin. I'd like to welcome you to our Continuing in the Trenches series. We've got a really interesting topic today that has recently come to the forefront with guidance from both prudential regulators as well as from Treasury. We're going to be talking today about cybersecurity and the risks associated with customers in this unique COVID-19 environment, as well as risks associated with your institution as you shift to a remote workforce and remote work environments. Today's subtopic could be the most fun we've had all this time. We're joined today by one of my colleagues, Lynda Jensen, in our Boston office. She has worked both at Fidelity, focusing on financial institutions, and then at Travelers, working on data breach responses and data breach prevention. She joined us about a year and a half ago and is one of the leads of our data security practice, and so we're glad to have her today. You know, and it's unique. As we were talking and preparing today, she made an interesting comment, which is, you know, the reason why financial institutions are so targeted is you're holding both data and money. And so you are a very rich environment for anyone attempting to compromise security systems. Not only can they get very, very sensitive data, but they also can get access potentially to large amounts of funds. In terms of where we're going today, we're going to set a little bit of the framework about, you know, what are we talking about when we talk about cybersecurity? You know, how do we place this in context? What are the different aspects of cybersecurity that we need to be thinking about as financial institutions during the crisis? We'll then shift, talk a little bit about the current threat landscape. Then Lynda will continue talking about what our biggest risks are, and, you know, great point here, which is, you know, the real risk is hacking the human. If we look at what the main intrusion methods are, how individuals are getting into our systems, it's usually the human element that is the hardest to control, even regardless of the number of security features you can put inside of your infrastructure. And then we'll talk briefly about self-defense, what you can do, and you know, what you need to be doing from a regulatory standpoint when you detect these intrusions. Turn over now to Lynda. Welcome her this morning. Let her talk a little bit about kind of what it is when we talk about cybersecurity, what those aspects are, and then we'll start putting this in perspective.
Great. Thanks, Brad. Good morning, everyone. So as Brad mentioned, I am a data privacy and cybersecurity attorney, and one of the things I wanted to run through today are some of the cybersecurity considerations that this pandemic and the new normal, the work from home, has created. So in particular, the remote working has set up some vulnerabilities that we should be aware of, that we should understand and try to minimize. My experience in working and interacting with threat actors is that they are never at a loss for ways to exploit vulnerabilities. So what we want to do is make sure that we're making it as hard as possible for the bad guys to gain access to the information and money that you're holding. So to make sure that we're all on the same page, when I say cybersecurity, what I'm talking about is protecting that critical data that you hold from all of the risks imposed by the threat actors who have different motives for why they want to take either the money or the data, but they go in through various threat vectors. So I want to just run through the 5 areas there, just so that we're all on the same page. So for the critical data that you hold, primarily what folks are looking to obtain is that personal information about your customers, your members, that they can use to commit identity fraud or identity theft. It has a value on the dark web. It can be sold individually, a social security number or as part of a dossier that they put together with respect to you. But any information that they can obtain is highly valuable to them and can be sold for monetary, for quite a lot of money. So the risks, and you'll see under the critical data, there are things like health and payment card information that have definite value. And in fact, right now, health information is priced higher than social security numbers. But primarily, it's that identifiable information that stays with you, that can't be changed for you, and that somebody can actually use to harm you. So the risks are both the reputational damage that you're going to suffer if it turns out that you're holding sensitive information and you didn't take the proper steps to keep that from falling into the wrong hands. So the reputational damage is also potentially the financial harm that can lead to regulatory fines, lawsuits, and those types of things. And, because, as Brad was mentioning, because you are a special industry, you have considerations to look at for your customers and your members. So it could be redirecting your members and customers' funds that ultimately leads to a financial loss. So it may not just be your financial loss, but it could also be those that you work with. Threat actors. So we use the term broadly threat actors. I like bad guys personally, but threat actors can be a variety of different people. Most of the time they're there to steal the data and steal the money, and they're part of that criminal organization. But there are different types of attacks that can occur, that can happen for political reasons, for a variety of things. One thing that I want you to really think about is that the insider negligence and malicious piece. So we have the rogue employees who go out and do bad things, but we also have employees who click on links or do things that are just careless on their part, but not, there's no ill motive behind it. That can cause just as much harm to you as that criminal who's hacking into your system. And then, of course, your third parties, the third parties that you work with, whatever their level of security is what you're having to navigate. So the motives, as we talked about, are for financial gain, reputational damage. They sometimes they just want to wreak havoc. Most of the time, they want money. Threat vectors, and we'll talk about these a little bit later, but the threat vectors can come from a variety of different approaches. Ransomware and business email compromise or social engineering fraud are the two that are probably the biggest that we have. So, so at this point, what we want to do is talk about those controls, the people, the process, technology, all of that, to help you become as secure as possible. Can we go to the next slide? So I like this slide here because you can have all the security bells and whistles in place, but you are only as secure as your least compliant employee. So if you have policies, procedures set up, you have the technology in place, but nobody follows it, it's like this example here for locking the door. You can have the best lock on your door here, but if people don't remember when they're leaving the house to shut the door, turn the key, double check to make sure it actually locks when you turn the key, those types of things, the lock has actually little to no value. So it's only using it and using it correctly that provides the value. So do you want to move on?
And so as we think about kind of the current threat landscape, we pulled together some statistics here for you, just to put this in perspective and why we reached out to Lynda, because we think it's unique in the volume and the targeting of financial institutions right now. And so these are just a few of the statistics that we're seeing over the last month in terms of the increase in the volume of attempts at cyber attacks. Everything from Google seeing a 350% increase in the creation of new phishing websites. They're seeing about 18 million additional malware and phishing emails every day. This one candidly shocked me. Barracuda Sentinel, which is one of the monitoring services, saw almost a 7x or 700% increase in spear phishing attacks just in 1 month. IC3, the FBI group that looks at internet crime and online crime, similarly seeing huge spikes. Malwarebytes, Sans, everyone is seeing huge increases over the last month relating to cyber attacks. And so, when we think about it, it is a very opportune time for those bad actors that Lynda was just mentioning to try to take advantage of customers who are now isolated at home, working over home networks, which tend to be less secure than the ones they may have in their place of business. Similarly, you have a lot of people who are not used to interfacing with banks and credit unions and lenders in an online environment or a mobile environment. They're all new to this. They're now using mobile banking, online banking, making payments online, and it's very easy for someone to, for instance, we've had a lot with our lenders of individuals spoofing those companies and saying, dear Mr. and Ms. Smith, please be aware that your payment is late. Click here to immediately pay it. and they are using public records to find liens and whatnot, so that it appears that it's coming from that particular customer's lender or financial institution. And people are scared of that right now. You know, they're new to this. They're working from home, and they see this, and so you see a huge increase in opportunities for cyber criminals to make these attacks. And then similarly, you've seen a 30% or more increase in remote working, people using either, and Lynda is much better at talking about this than I am, but remote desktops are using VPNs so that their workers can work remotely from home. And again, as Lynda mentioned, you know, you can have within your business, within your financial institution, within your loan company, the most robust security in the world. And you know, now you have those employees who are working on those home networks. Maybe they're using public Wi-Fi, particularly in larger cities where there is more public Wi-Fi infrastructure. And all of those are now putting in unique risk factors that we didn't really see a month or 2 months ago. You know, and with that has been these increases in COVID-19 specific phishing, people using the pandemic as an opportunity to target customers. You know, and then similarly, and Lynda will get into these in a lot more detail, but we continue to see ransomware, you know, where individuals are having their computers, or a business is having its computer targeted. A ransom is demanded oftentimes in untraceable cryptocurrencies. For the release of that information. Trojans, we have seen a big increase in some of the banking Trojans that have spiked in end of 2019. They have now come back to the forefront, where a report came out earlier today that these banking Trojans, Lynda, I think I'm pronouncing these correct, Imitet and TrickBot, are now back to the #1 Trojans that are being released at the moment. Because it's specifically targeting online and mobile banking solutions. But then you also have individuals who may be working more remotely. They think that security is more relaxed or lenient, that, you know, the ability of a supervisor or you know, your IT infrastructure to oversee what it is they're doing has been you know, relaxed potentially, and so we see a lot more employees are taking more liberties with the hardware that is provided to those employees. And then obviously we talk specifically about you know, the remote work targeting. You know, we've seen similarly, you know, the nature of the pandemic is causing a lot of people to become very desperate, meaning they see information such as, you know, we have an example here from the Microsoft Threat Intelligence Report that just came out. You know, what in the past would have been, you know, please pay this bill. It's got what appears to be an invoice attached, and trying to encourage people to click on that file that would contain the malicious script that would then infect the computer. Now, it's specifically shifting and targeting healthcare providers. You know, one of the scariest ones I've seen recently is there's a whole series of emails that are floating around where individuals are saying you have a loved one who's been admitted to the hospital, you're not allowed to come see them, but if you'd like to have, you know, in essence, FaceTime or you know, a virtual meeting with them, they'd love to see you to keep their spirits up, and encouraging you to click on links so that you can spend time with that loved one. And it's just preying on, you know, that fear, that natural human emotion, and the inability of individuals to have very clear communication with each other. And so, you know, we see these things, even, you know, the CDC saying, you know, here's important updates. It makes it appear that it's a governmental communication, something that's important, carries, you know, marks of legitimacy. And then all of these individuals who are now working full-time from home may be tricked into clicking those links because they are specifically concerned about the current pandemic environment. You know, and then the other big thing that we have been seeing with our financial institutions, we've been having a lot of calls with this, is for the first time you have significant numbers of employees working remotely. These are some of the latest threat assessments that have come out. Reposify tracks the number of remote desktops that are exposed to the internet, meaning they are not secured. And so they've gone through and they've actually been tracking how many are just exposed openly to the internet, where any individual could then access those remote desktops and view what that computer is doing. And we've seen a big spike in it, and more than 4 million, getting close to 5 million now, according to Reposify, are now just publicly exposed to the internet so that an individual could go and access that. Hopefully it's not any of our lenders or financial institutions, but something you should be aware of. Similarly, you've seen some pretty big name vulnerabilities that have been exposed. There was a Citrix vulnerability discovered in late 2019 that was released. There continues to be patches released for that, but a number are still not completely patched. And then an assessment recently of financial institutions specifically looked at how many financial institutions had non-patched Citrix vulnerabilities, and a large number, in fact, did. Similarly, Microsoft Teams had an ability of an individual or non-intended participants to actually access the Microsoft Teams meetings. And so you had a vulnerability there that Microsoft has been trying to update. But there similarly, when you go in and you look, a lot of the financial institutions may not have fully updated their Microsoft Teams software, and with the number of individuals using those now, just saw the Microsoft Q1 report, Teams is going, is probably one of their fastest growing divisions at the moment. And so the number of institutions that are using it is skyrocketing, but there is some potential vulnerabilities here, particularly if you're not running the most updated versions. Lynda, any thoughts on that and some of the remote workforce issues?
Yeah, absolutely. With respect to the Microsoft piece, Office 365 breaches or data events have been ones that have been keeping us really, really busy. What happens is there was a functionality issue with respect to Microsoft, and with multi-factor authentication, you can navigate around it, but if that's not enabled, so if you don't have a two-pronged authentication process, then the threat actors can get into the system, navigate through, and have visibility. They can set up forwarding rules. They can delete rules. They'll search for particular terms. They'll create global admin accounts. And sometimes they'll sync to external devices and download the entirety of the email boxes or contents of your technology environment. So it can be really, really challenging. And with respect to the RDP piece, which we'll talk about a little bit more in detail, the ability for the threat actors to really get in there and set up shop is a dangerous thing. So if you want to move on to the next slide. So circling back to the threat landscape, which we had talked about at the outset, making sure that we're understanding the threats, the targets, and the ways that they go about doing it. So it's criminals, certainly, to be sure, who hack into the system. But it's also employees, clients, customers, a ton of different ways in which information that should be kept out of the public domain falls into the wrong hands. So when you are thinking about your cybersecurity posture, make sure that you're understanding all the different individuals who potentially have access to it, not just the bad guys that you're trying to keep out. With the targeted assets, obviously the money is great. The personal information, the PIN numbers, employee information, let's not forget that component piece. We're really focused so much on our customers and members that we sometimes forget we hold a ton of information with respect to employees. If you offer employees healthcare benefits or death benefits, you probably have information about their family members, and it's all sensitive information that you're expected to keep secure. The attack methods, phishing is going to be probably the biggest one that we have, and it's through the idea of social engineering or manipulating the situation so that what is actually a fraudulent scheme appears legitimate, and it dupes an employee into believing that they're actually complying with a real request, and they disclose either money or data. We had a big scheme a couple years ago where somebody would impersonate the head of HR, that type of thing, and ask for everybody's social security numbers, all the employees' social security numbers, and then they would file false tax returns. So it can happen with data. It can also happen with money. I'm your boss, and I'm out of the office right now, and I need you to wire some money because I'm closing a deal. It's a super secret deal, so please don't tell anybody about it, but can you wire that money to me? They're very clever in how they come up with these schemes, and we see a lot of damage done with respect to that.
That's an interesting point, Lynda, because we had that happen to a client of one of our financial institutions, and we're talking tens of millions of dollars, but same thing. They said in the remote work environment, someone spoofed the CEO of the company and had instructed a series of overseas wires, and was very aggressive about it. In essence, kind of yelling and screaming to get it done quickly. And there's no ability now for a bookkeeper to walk down to see his or her boss and say, hey, is this really you? We're all working remotely and trying to communicate by phone. And so in that case, about $18 million got wired overseas inadvertently, just because of an internal control issue.
Absolutely, we see that all the time, and you raise a couple of good points there. So the threat actors are actually really very good at masking who they are. They'll come into your system, they'll do recon work and figure out how people communicate with each other. Do they say Mr. Smith, Tom, Tommy, Thomas? How do you communicate so that when you receive the email, it sounds familiar, it sounds comforting? They also will impersonate somebody just a little bit up the rung. So if you are a front desk person and you get an email from the CEO of a Fortune 500 company, you're going to look at that and say, there's no way I'm actually going to follow the request. It doesn't fit. But if you are only one rung or two rungs above and you're asking for a request, most people are hesitant to actually go to that person and say, is this really you? Most of them say that's a legitimate request, it sounds right, and that's where you end up losing a lot of the money and data. We also have DDoS attacks that are making a comeback. So DDoS attacks are ones that are going to overwhelm the system and make it impossible for your customers to transact their business. These actually come with some potential business interruption losses on your end, because if computerized attacks on your system make it impossible for your member or customer to sign their loan documentation or wire funds for a time-sensitive deal, those types of things, it can have an actual financial impact on you. More than just an annoyance, DDoS is a particularly challenging type of event for financial services companies. Can we go on to the next? So hacking the human. So let's think about this for a second. If I want to brute force my way into your system, I'm going to have to move past your firewalls, your antivirus, and multi-factor authentication, whatever technology-based solutions you have in place, your endpoint monitoring, all of that, to try to get through to get into the system. But if I can manipulate one of your employees to open the door for me, it is so much easier to do. So phishing attacks have taken that forefront in causing infiltrations and ultimately harm, because it's so much easier than doing it the other way. Can we go on to the next slide? So how do we identify a phishing email? There are some telltale signs that you often see. Everyone heard about the Nigerian prince scheme and thought about how could anybody actually fall for something like that. They're much more sophisticated these days. So I'll pose a question to all of you just to think about. But when you receive an email and you know it's from an external source, do you actually hover over the address or email address to make sure that it's coming from the place that you would expect it to? I can tell you that I do not always do that, and I do this for a living. I know a lot of people don't, and that's one of the things that bad actors are hoping that you won't see. You notice up on the top my email address. The first one is my actual address. The second one is a spoofed address. So the differences are minimal. There are only two. One is the period between my first and last name has now been set up as an underscore, and Nelson Mullins has been shortened by removing the S. Something like that is very easy for your eyes to read past and not really appreciate that you're no longer actually communicating with the person you thought you were. You're also going to see some urgency in there. It's the deal has to close by X date. If you don't respond by a particular time of the day, then this is going to be charged against your account. There's going to be some urgency to it that is designed to interfere with you going to your higher ups and really considering whether this is an appropriate transaction. So there's that urgency piece to it. They're also going to try to be as official as possible. So moving outside of the employee to employee type scheme that we were talking about earlier, you'll get an email from the IRS, you'll get an email from the FBI. It looks really very official, and nobody wants to ignore the FBI, right, or IRS. So when you see it, you're instantly, I want to figure out what this is and see if I have any obligations with respect to it. It's almost always going to have an embedded link or an attachment. Click on this and we'll redirect you to the IRS so that you can take care of your tax deficiency or those types of things with respect to the COVID-19. We're going to redirect you to the site so you can check on the status of the payment that you're expecting from the federal government. Those types of things. What happens is you click on that link or attachment, it usually pops up as nothing, it's a blank document. And what, from your perspective, you're looking at, you say, oh, maybe they failed to attach it properly, no big deal, and you go on with your day. Well, the problem is what has just happened now is you've created an entry point for the threat actor into your system where they can deploy viruses or malware in the system. They can release the banking trojans that Brad was talking about earlier to go and harvest credentials for you. We'll talk about again in a moment, but they can do all sorts of things, set it up, and then ultimately deploy ransomware in your system, just by clicking that one little link. So also look for it to be impersonal. So sometimes the request will say, good afternoon, but not address you formally. There'll be spelling mistakes, syntax errors, those types of things. If you have something that raises an eyebrow, that gives you just a moment's pause, ask someone, follow up with someone. It's really important to look at each of the emails that comes into you suspiciously. Can you move on? So we're talking a lot about phishing. There's also a really strong attempt at vishing right now. What vishing is the same idea as a phishing email. It's designed to dupe the person on the other end, but it's done by a phone call. And what we're seeing a lot of right now for this during this pandemic is somebody impersonating Microsoft support, saying, knowing that you as your business operate on an O365 environment, calling and saying, we are having some issues with respect to loading some of the programs. If you could just log in your credentials, I'll hop on and I'll fix the problem for you. And people are getting that information over because a lot of people have had some difficulty logging onto their systems. There have been a lot of issues. So when somebody's calling to say, hey, I can help you with those, and it doesn't sound out of the norm, people are doing it. Just to let you know, the IRS, a scam that I almost fell victim to, the IRS will never actually call you at home to request anything from you. They'll send it to you either electronically or in the mail. So beware of anyone claiming to be from the IRS. I can also tell you, interestingly, I've been getting a lot of texts lately that say, your Amazon package is delayed. Please click here to find out more information, or those types of things. And for me, it hasn't been an issue because the Amazon account that I have is set up under my husband's name and it has his phone number, so there would be no way for Amazon to actually be reaching out to me. That said, those types of solicitations can create a lot of havoc for you. Move on to the next slide. So when you're watching for phishing, like I said, hover over that email address. Make sure that it's the correct email address, that it's spelled the way you would expect it to be spelled. So here you see American Express, and there's the E from the Express is left off, but we look at Amex, and we're accustomed to seeing the X, and that might not immediately jump out at you. There's always going to be something, like I mentioned, about the urgency. It's going to say, there's a large purchase, and if you didn't make that, reach out to us immediately. Click here, we'll take care of it for you. So they have to compel you to take action because there's this urgency and need to not put them in harm's way. And so that's what the threat actors will do, is they'll prey on your vulnerabilities, they'll prey on your the chaos that we're living in right now, and the inability to slow down and figure things out. They're hoping that you're just going to be too stressed, too restless, and click on a link. Can we go on to the next slide? So as I was mentioning, we have these email compromises. They're sometimes called social engineering frauds, or sometimes called business email compromises, but they are all those emails that are manipulating individuals into sharing data on money in belief that they're complying with a legitimate request. So that makes up a really good portion of the types of events that happen that threat actors are able to take advantage of non-suspecting individuals. Ransomware is the other one. So Brad alluded to ransomware earlier. The ransomware gets deployed in your system typically after the threat actor has been in it for a while. So a phishing email comes to one of your employees. They click on the attachment. The attachment is empty. They go on their day, not realizing that they've actually opened the portal. The threat actor comes in, sets up shop, releases whatever virus or Trojan it wishes, looks through the information, gauges how much you can actually afford to pay so that it can set an appropriate ransom, establishes backdoors. They can be in your system for months before you actually realize that they're there. And then they ultimately deploy this ransomware. And the ransomware is going to say, I've locked up all of your files. Everything is completely encrypted. If you'd like to get your files back, pay me this ransom that I've asked for. Now, there are some ransom variants that cannot do anything other than lock down the system. So, for example, when we were talking about Imitat and Triplock, the two banking Trojans earlier, oftentimes threat actors will use that in conjunction with a ransomware variant like Ryuk, which does not have exfiltration capabilities or anything. So they go in there, deploy the Trojans, have it navigate through the system, scraping and collecting all sorts of passwords, and then deploy the ransomware. So sometimes they have to do them in tandem. And I kid you not, I was working with a forensic vendor and looking through the dark web type activities that you can do. You can actually purchase ransomware separately, or you can purchase it as a package with Trojans and other malware attached to it. You actually go through it kind of the same way you would at Amazon or Walmart or anywhere else, picking and choosing what you want to perpetrate the exact scheme that you need. One additional thing that we've seen with respect to ransomware is there are new variants like Soto and Kobe, which the threat actor will actually take the information that you have and hold it hostage for a payment. So they'll take your customer's information and say, I'm going to disclose this to the public unless you pay me the ransom. They will give you samples of what they have. You go back and you try to negotiate and you say that Bitcoin demand was way too high and I can't afford to pay it, and they send you a document and says, here are your financials, you absolutely can afford to pay it, and I want my ransom, or I'm releasing this to the public. So ransomware has become much more sophisticated than it was even just a couple of years ago, and in combination with the business email compromises, they make up more than half of what you're ultimately going to see for any kind of event. So I just want to touch on the other ones just real quickly. Keep in mind, I was mentioning that you could have employees involved, and it can be a situation where it's just negligence on their part, nothing nefarious occurring. But when we first started seeing cyber matters, so 2014, 15, we really starting to take hold. The majority of them were inadvertent disclosures by an employee. So I intended to email one person, and I emailed a whole group of other people, those types of things. Lost devices, so laptops or cell phones that contain sensitive information being lost, or rogue employees, somebody who thought they should have gotten a promotion, they're frustrated, so before they give notice and leave, they plug in a zip drive and they take all your information. That was a focus a few years back and really was largely what we were dealing with. It's not as much now because the business email compromises and ransomware have really taken hold. But keep in mind that if you are holding sensitive data, there are many, many ways that it can fall into the wrong hands. We'll move on to the next one. So, as I mentioned before, be suspicious of your email. Be suspicious of the attachment. It looks like it's a trusted source, but it's not really the type of communications that they would send to you. It has weird language in it, or it's making a request that isn't normal. Contact the individual directly. So most of your financial institution bonds are going to ask that you have some form of out-of-band verification set up to determine whether a request is legitimate. Do that with your emails as well. Contact the known person at the company and say, did you send this? Don't respond to the email. Don't respond to the phone number in the email. So have an external way of communicating. Don't provide confidential information over the phone. Really, there are certain ways you can verify that it's a legitimate request, but mostly just don't do it. It's really hard to come back from that. Validate the request, either through that out-of-band verification or through some other validation process, whether if somebody needs to make a wire from their account, they have to go through multiple steps of security questions. Make sure you have a process in place for validating that what the person is requesting is legitimate, because to go back to what we were talking about earlier, your customer or your member, whatever their level of security is, it's not sufficient to keep a threat actor out of their system. Somebody can come in, impersonate them, and make you ultimately the victim if you don't have proper validation in place. And
yeah,
again,
that's a great point there, Lynda, because we've seen a lot of that with, banks and credit unions trying to be accommodating to remote individuals. And, there may not be formal policies about how you authenticate people, on a telephone call. These individuals traditionally would have come in, maybe they'd sign a wire request, and you'd get a copy of their driver's license. And a lot of our financial institutions, particularly smaller ones, don't have very formalized procedures about how you do, wires or official check requests in a non-face-to-face environment. And it's something that's become more and more key. And so I think you make a great point there, which is having good, clean policies and procedures and guides for your customer service individuals about how they're going to do that is absolutely critical, because we've seen a lot of fraud associated with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to say also, with respect to that, the balance between being accommodating to your customers and actually making sure you have secure policies and procedures in place to keep everybody safe. It's a really tough one to balance. We saw with the remote capture deposit, when people take a picture of their check and it gets uploaded into their system. Pre-COVID-19, when people were still out and about, you would see individuals take that picture, deposit their account, and then walk into the issuing bank and cash it right there, so they would get a double payout. So there are different ways that convenience can also create some additional exposure to you. So to try to keep that balance in mind. Inconvenience only lasts so long. These data events can be a nightmare to navigate. We go to the next slide.
There we go.
So passwords is actually one of my favorite topics to talk about. I once heard that the average individual has fewer than 6 passwords that he or she uses to protect both personal and professional information. So consider for a moment if one of those banking Trojans in McCaver TrickBot go into the system and they're scraping passwords, and you have just logged into your bank account, entered your information, and they have that. For all of the accounts that you use that one password for, they now have it. And as I was mentioning earlier, they build dossiers on you. So if they can get a couple of your passwords, you're really in a tough spot. So never use, and you should have a policy in place for the employees, never use the same passwords for your personal information as you do for your professional information. Passphrases are actually much stronger, much harder to crack, so use those. Anytime you can, really make sure that the multi-factor authentication that you have, the layers of protection that you've put in place, that it coincides with logging on to the system, and that it's changed. So you require password changes more frequently. And I know you'll get pushback from employees. It's an inconvenience, and I don't like having to deal with multi-factor authentication, putting a second layer of protection in there. You're so much better off if you can put those procedures in place, specifically now that we're working remotely, to make sure that when somebody is actually using the system, they're authorized to be in there. And don't share with anyone. It's mind-boggling to me that my assistant will freely give over her password to me if I need to get into her account. Please make sure that all of your folks realize they should not be sharing the passwords with anyone. Move on to the next slide. So we were talking earlier about remote desktop protocols. There are two different ways that you can be externally allowed into your system. If you have a VPN, virtual private network, what it does is it takes that security that you have at your business and extends it to the home and protects the access. Remote desktop does it kind of in reverse, where remote says, I'm going to use the internet and I'm going to remote into the environment. That remoting into the environment actually requires that a portal be open to allow you to gain access. That open portal actually allows threat actors potentially to get into your system as well. So I was talking with a forensic vendor the other day and trying to figure out what we anticipate the next few months up to a year to look like post resuming activities. And what the general thinking is in the forensic world is threat actors are coming in through these open portals. They're setting up shop in your system. They're harvesting data. They're getting ready to move forward with deploying ransomware or some other kind of malware in your system. But they go in, they set up shop, and then they sit quietly. They're sitting quietly waiting for you to resume your operations, get back to business where you can afford to pay a ransom. And as things move forward, the expectation is that multiple entities are going to be hit by ransomware over the next few months. So heads up if you are using a remote desktop protocol that you should be checking your firewall and antivirus logs, any endpoint monitoring you have, just to make sure that those who are remoting in are legitimately authorized to be there. Can we go on to the next slide? So virtual meetings. I imagine everyone on the call has heard quite a lot actually about Zoom and some of the security failures or concerns that have happened, the individuals who are jumping on and sharing pornographic videos or photographs, engaging in hate speech, those types of things. My husband's a teacher, and it's really challenging when he's working with elementary age students to have that concern that somebody may be coming in and doing something nefarious that can impact his kids. So that obviously is a concern to be sure, but for a financial institution or financial services company, there's another concern that is raised. If you are on a call and you are discussing sensitive information about your customers or members, and you have somebody who's not authorized actually appear into your meeting, that can ultimately create some obligations, some notification obligations and reporting requirements as a result of that. And Craig will get into that a little bit later. But just beware of the concerns being greater for you. It's not just the embarrassment or the frustration of having somebody come in and interrupt your meeting. It can actually trigger legal obligations on your part. Can we go on to the next slide? So what do you do to actually avoid it? Don't make the meetings public. Make sure that you're not sharing it on any kind of public site, or it's not being accessed in some public venue. Make sure it's host only for screen sharing. Make sure that you either follow your policies and procedures for teleworking, or if you don't have them, that you create them so that individuals can know exactly what is expected of them and how to handle having virtual meetings safely. Go to the next slide. So, and you'll see that the number of people who have reported decreased use in Zoom when the pandemic happened, the use of Zoom skyrocketed, and it wasn't fully prepared to handle the volume and the types of activities that were happening, and that's where all these problems came from. Zoom has made some adjustments, and they're continually working on that, but it has caused people to shy away from it. Keep in mind, though, if you just move to another platform and aren't taking the steps to protect yourself that would protect you on Zoom or any other platform, you're going to run the same risk. Move on to the next slide. So, remote working. Understanding what information you have is a really important starting point for figuring out what you need to protect and how you need to go about doing that. So if you have information that is sensitive in nature and you have the ability to encrypt it, both when you're transmitting it electronically to somebody, as well as when it's at rest in your environment, any sensitive information that you can encrypt, do. So the way that the data privacy laws work is that if somebody gains access to your system, but the only thing they have access to is encrypted data, which they can't decrypt, they don't have an ability to decrypt, your legal obligations are minimized at that point. So anything you can do to keep it encrypted, that's terrific. Don't have people forward to their personal email addresses. Have a policy in place that says they shouldn't do that. The reason is obviously your system is going to be much more secure than the Yahoo or Google or Hotmail account that your employee has set up. And once that information gets over there, if their system is accessed, you're still on the hook because it's information that you were supposed to keep private, and it was accessed by somebody without authorization to do it. If you're going to disclose the information and it's sensitive in nature, indicate on there somehow that it's sensitive or confidential so that the individual receiving it is aware of the need to take extra steps to protect it as well. If you can send it in a secure link, that's always best. But at a minimum, identify it so that you're all on the same page and taking efforts to minimize the potential for unauthorized access. Smart technology, I think a lot of people have heard about Alexa and the issues that it was capturing information. So you go into the store, Alexa is playing, you give your credit card number or some other sensitive information, your driver's license number, something along that line, and it was being recorded. So be careful. There's a concept called the Internet of Things, and the idea behind it is if a threat actor gains access to one of the devices in your home that is interconnected with all the others, that it can navigate freely through. So, there have been situations where you've been locked out of your house, and if you don't pay a ransom, then they won't unlock the code, those types of things. So just be really careful if you have interconnected devices in your home. They can create a lot of havoc. Make sure that everybody is updating their systems. And again, you get pushback from employees, but really, really important that the updates are actually being pushed through and out to all of your remote workers. Open and unsecure Wi-Fi networks are a fascinating area to talk about. When this pandemic starts to ease the restrictions, the government starts easing those restrictions, individuals are likely going to be showing up at coffee shops or delis or whatnot just to get out of the house for a few minutes, and they may log on to their computers when they do that. And open public Wi-Fi is not secure. There are a lot of devices. There's one device called a Pineapple, which allows you to sit near somebody who has logged on to a public Wi-Fi and gain access to all of the information that they have on their computer, just sitting near them in a coffee shop. So it's really, really dangerous. Make sure that you have a policy or procedure in place to ensure that people aren't using public Wi-Fi. Verify your recipients and maintain your standards. It's going to take an extra amount of vigilance on your part and the part of your employees to make sure that you are doing everything that you possibly can to limit unauthorized access into your system and to the data and money that you're holding. Again, going back to what we were saying earlier, a customer or member, their systems are set up in a way that fully and completely protects them or protects them as well as they possibly can. It's a dangerous situation for you. So your folks need to be extra vigilant in that. Brad, can we move on to the next? So again, I can't stress it enough, beware of the public Wi-Fi. But if you start to see things slowing down in your system, you get locked out, you're being asked for password changes at times that don't make sense for you. Your browser is being redirected. You can notice that there are SQL injection attacks that can happen, and oftentimes you'll notice in one of the upper corners a little icon that wasn't there previously that looks innocuous enough, but it's really the threat actor who's come into your system and is harvesting data. So I'm applying for a loan with you, and I enter your loan portal, and I enter all of my sensitive information, and that's actually being harvested by the threat actor and not actually going to you for processing. So just be really, really careful. If something looks a little bit off, reach out to your IT, reach out to whoever it is internally for you that you would report concerns to. It's really not overly sensitive to do that. You know, I know some people try to figure it out on their own. I would strongly encourage you to share that information. Go on to the next one. So this is a great slide that Brad added here. So it's interesting as we're talking about things to come. The Small Business Association has been inundated with requests for information and assistance during this COVID-19 outbreak. And as a result of that, likely somebody clicked on something they shouldn't have, and it led to the data breach. We talked about Zoom bombing. Congress was Zoom bombed. So what I really want you to take away from this slide is if a threat actor wants to get into your system, wants to steal data, wants to steal money, wants to wreak havoc on your system, there's only so much that you can do to prevent that from happening. What cybersecurity is really designed to do is to say, let's talk about those things that you can do and make it as hard as possible for somebody to get into your system so that they give up and realize it's easier to go to somebody less prepared than you and attack their system. So they move on from you. That's what cybersecurity is about. Nobody is ever 100% secure. As you can see, very big public entities being impacted. No one's completely secure, but you can be as secure as possible to minimize the potential harm. So you've heard me chatting for quite a while, so I'm going to kick it over to Craig, and we can go on from here.
Thanks, Lynda. So we wanted to address what your responsibilities are while protecting customers and what the regulators are looking at and focusing on in the spaces of identity theft and data privacy. So first, we wanted to point out how these scams are presenting themselves under the current circumstances in the pandemic. Given the scale of the pandemic, it would be a good idea to document your awareness and attempts to limit harm from these scams through communication with those charged with controlling this activity within your risk, compliance, legal, and or your QA/QC functions, or going ahead and putting an update in your training manuals to these scams and possible scams relating to COVID-19 and the pandemic. Next slide, Brad. We also wanted to touch on what your responsibilities are under SAR reporting. So FinCEN has issued a couple of pieces of guidance over the last 3 or 4 years. Starting in October of 2016, we saw this FIN 2016 A005 guidance issued. The link there is provided if you want to go check it out, you should. This one is missed by a lot of clients due to lack of communication between BSA and AML departments and the internal or external IT functions. But within the guidance, it outlines an entity's need to report cyber-enabled crimes and cyber events through SARs, what to include in the SAR for cyber-related events, including the description and magnitude of the events, known or suspected time, location, characteristics or signatures of the event, indicators of compromise, relevant IP addresses and their timestamps, device identifiers, and the methodologies used. It also goes on to state that it's necessary that there be collaboration between your BSA and AML departments and units and your in-house cybersecurity units in order to properly identify and report the suspicious activity. And they're looking at this not only from a safety and soundness perspective of your individual institution, but they do see this as a systemic issue for the whole industry as well. They want to see as much sharing of this information as possible, so they want to see these SARs reported, and if they start to note that you're not doing that or these links are missing within your institution, they will hit you with findings. Finally, they also state that the sharing of the information between financial institutions is not only permitted, but also encouraged. They want to see like working groups and the active sharing of this information. The next piece of guidance was issued in 2017 in October. This one covers potentially fraudulent activity related to disaster relief efforts, which would include this pandemic. In part, it again covers SAR reporting and cyber-related fraud. They go on to state that bad actors take advantage of public interest during natural disasters, and they want to make you aware of possible scams that are ongoing. They point out that there's a need for banks to be aware of public reporting on disaster phishing campaigns, like Lynda was referencing, malicious websites, associated malware, and red flags, in order to be able to self-identify these issues internally and potentially report any self-identified issues. The final one there, most recently, we saw in March last month, FinCEN not issue official guidance, but come out with a statement. They reminded us that they've already seen imposter scams, investment scams, product scams, insider trading associated with COVID-19, and again, reminds you that your requirement of SAR reporting around these issues, and also to tag field 2 in your SAR template with COVID-19 in that field, along with checking the appropriate SAR template boxes for other typologies that are required. Next slide, Brad. The CFPB focus on identity theft. This is important to look at and be aware of. Over the past couple of years, we've seen the CFPB raise data privacy and cybersecurity issues as one of their primary focuses and one of their priorities. We see it when they issue supervisory highlights quarterly or any other supervision activity that comes out that's tangentially related. We are also starting to see EICs ask more and more questions around the links between covered institutions, compliance departments, and the IT departments, as well as the vendor management functions within covered institutions, just given the high possibility of consumer harm. Most recently up here, we have 2 examples over the past 12 months that we've seen. In last year's debt collection, in late 2019, the CFPB issued complaint data for debt collection and noted that the portion of complaints that are classified as complaints about attempts to collect the debt not owed because the debt was a result of identity theft has risen year over year, 25% in 2019, from 20% in 18, and 11% in 17. They also make a specific point in this narrative that they drive their supervision and enforcement activity from the complaint databases. So you can tell that they're going to start looking at identity theft, data privacy issues within the debt collection spaces for all covered entities. And that's historically not something that we've looked at, but you should be aware that it's going to be developing. Also, from Equifax, we'll discuss on the next slide, but the statement is a good indication of the Bureau's intention of making cybercrime, cybersecurity, data privacy a priority for the Bureau. Next slide, Brad. I'm going to try to speed this up to see if we can fit any Q&A in, but I did want to point out Dwala and Equifax and the UDAP enforcement that's utilized to kind of expand the CFPB's jurisdiction into data privacy. There's nothing in the regulations that grants the CFPB authority to regulate data privacy and information security over covered institutions. But what we saw in Dwala in 2016, which was a state licensed money transmitter fintech, that claimed they had that their data security was best in class. The Bureau came in and used those statements to say that they were deceptive when, in fact, their data security practices were lax in multiple areas. Instead of focusing on the marketing of that, which they would have authority over, they used that UDAP and deceptive practices language in Dodd-Frank to then attack the actual policies and procedures of the data privacy controls that Dwala had. And then we saw it again on a larger scale in 2019 with Equifax. Again, here they used UDAP to say that it was unfair practices. The policies and procedures that were deployed within Equifax were unfair practices given the threats that Equifax was aware of, and even going as far as to criticize their breach response, saying that that was deceptive and unfair to the consumers who had their identities hacked. It's a good idea to be mindful of the CFPB's push into these spaces and maybe start looking at your policies and procedures that are not historically thought to trigger CFPB oversight in a light that is going to require your thinking ahead, knowing that the CFPB is going to start to ask for this data. Next slide, Brad. And this is just a kind of to sum up regarding against identity theft. We've seen these themes throughout today's talk, but we want you to focus on the workforce moving to remote workforce, what you're doing in the IT and data security spaces to control that fraud, what controls you have out there, your training, your procedures, continuing updating on scams, signs of fraud, signs of identity theft, what your responsibilities are under them, like the SAR reporting. And also just to remember to generally train when to contact law enforcement, when you have to escalate to the FBI, when you should be escalating to the Department of Justice, if you see any issues that require SAR filing or any vulnerable adult population that is affected by the fraud that you're monitoring.
Yeah, that's kind of a good point there, Craig.
On that?
Too, with some of the vulnerable adult issues, we see a lot of that, and almost every state now has some sort of law that protects financial institutions and their ability to report to some version of an adult protective services about suspected or potential abuse of an older adult. And there are mechanisms for that, and generally there are privileges associated with that shield you from liability as a financial institution, as long as you do it properly and kind of down the lines that have been set. And so if you do go down that route, you can really help some people out, but make sure you're working with compliance so it's done correctly. And Lynda, I think you want to add something?
Sure. I just wanted to comment on the law enforcement piece. So if it's a situation where you think that the identity fraud or theft is coming from somebody who gained access to your system and stole some of that data, first inclination is to reach out to law enforcement. I would caution you and ask that you strategically work through that process with your counsel that's helping you navigate the data event, because we have had situations where most of the time you report to IC3, they take a written explanation of what happens and you don't hear anything more. They're using that data on the other side to analyze and figure out what types of threats are out there so they can post alerts to various companies. But if you report it to someone that actually is really enthusiastic about investigating that particular type of an event, you run the risk of them coming in and taking your computer system so that they can look through it and figure out what happened. That creates challenges on your end for really understanding what happened, putting safeguards in place, and providing notification to impacted individuals. So just coordinate that with your attorney that's helping you navigate the data event.
Great point.
Well, that wraps it up. We've got some contact information here. I want to thank Lynda for joining me and Craig today on our Continuing in the Trenches series. If you have questions, feel free to send them in through the question portal on the GoToWebinar, or you can certainly reach out to us anytime. I will say Lynda, particularly given her background, focusing specifically on data security with financial institutions, is my go-to resource for all things data security planning, as well as data breach response with all of our financial services clients. She and her colleague Kevin Meckler in our Florida office is a great resource. Feel free to reach out to either of them. We did have one question that was raised by email to us. Lynda, what's your thought on sending out communications to customers or members regarding data security in light of COVID-19? Any concerns you have with that about trying to make sure they understand these increased risks?
So I don't have viscerally a concern with respect to it. One thing I will say is people are getting inundated with COVID-19 type emails, so you make sure that you do it in a way that actually grabs their attention. But what I would say is be careful as you're explaining what security you have in place and so forth, that you don't overstate it or that you don't show where your vulnerabilities lie, because any threat actor who's looking at that can use that then proactively against you. So definitely communicating with your clients, your customers, and members is really important to do, and to let them know that you have additional procedures that may slow the process, but they're designed to help them, protect them, secure their information. Definitely a great thing to do. Just be careful in the phrasing of what you share.
All right. Well, that looks like all our questions. I want to thank everybody for your participation today and in all of these In the Trenches webinars. We're going to be continuing them into May. We now have the Library of the 8 for the month of April that'll be available on the website. All the participants today will be getting a copy of these slides, and they'll also be posted publicly on the website. You can also download recordings of this on YouTube for your reference if you want to use them as part of training for other employees. Again, we want to thank all of you for all of your hard work, particularly focusing on customers and members who are being impacted by the pandemic. Next week on Tuesday, we'll have a webinar on fair lending concerns in a tightening credit market. And then Thursday, we'll be doing updates to PPP guidance and some of the recent issues that have arisen regarding borrower certifications of necessity, potentially borrowers repaying obligations to your institution for funds they got through the PPP program, and some of the nuances addressed in the FAQs regarding ownership, entities that may have transferred after February 15th, and some of the other questions we've gotten from the dozens of financial institutions we've been working with on their PPP rollouts. So if there's no further questions, I want to thank our presenters today. Wish all of you to stay safe, be well, and have a great weekend. Thanks again for participating in the Trenches.
Thanks, guys.